when Jung speaks about a symbol, he has in mind something that you can't really define, even if you uncover some of its meanings. There's always more. There's always something still elusive, something still unconscious, something that it carries that cannot be pinned down exactly. And so for Jung, symbols bring something into consciousness from the unconscious and from the depths of the unconscious, or often the archetypal unconscious, that we hadn't been aware of, that hadn't been available to conscious before that. And so the appearance of symbols have very much to do with expanding, extending consciousness as they arise in our dreams, in our imagination, or wherever we happen to confront them. The symbol for Jung is a bridge, in that it connects the conscious mind and the unconscious. And Jung felt that there was a great problem in modern consciousness, in modernity, that resulted from the gradual separation of the conscious mind from the unconscious mind, from the archaic or the primitive or the old brain, however you want to think about it, the instinctual mind, that as humans developed in culture over the centuries, and as their cultures gradually moved more toward sign cultures and away from symbolic cultures, away from mythological cultures into scientific cultures, different way of understanding the world, we human beings paid a huge price by losing contact with the deep layers of the unconscious mind. And for our mental health, it's important to be in touch with our instincts. That modern man, as Jung looked at modern man, sorry for the gender, modern human being, the person who lives in modernity and is more or less convinced that modernity has the truth. It's a kind of flat culture, a kind of flat world in which signs are very prevalent, but the sense of the symbolic is very absent. And the danger is that people are cut off from their instinctual knowledge, from a kind of knowledge that Jung felt primitives have. Jung was very interested in the primitive mind and studying the primitive mind because he felt that so-called primitive people don't have this problem. They aren't cut off from their instincts the way we are. And so they aren't neurotic. Neurosis comes out of this gap that develops between the conscious mind and the unconscious. Consciousness becoming more and more one-sided, more and more rational, quotes rational, and out of contact with the deeper layers of the unconscious, with one's instinctual background. And that symbols have the capacity to bridge this, that symbols can link the archaic mind to the highly rational conscious mind.
It used to be thought that the emergence of objects used for artistic, religious or decorative purposes could be dated to the Upper Paleolithic period, and that's around 35,000 years ago, because there's an explosion of cultural artifacts that are found in Europe, figurines and so forth, that date from that period. But this has actually been overturned by the discovery of clearly symbolic objects in Africa, particularly from the Blombus Caves in South Africa. And these date back around 75,000 years. And I want to show you a couple of these. Can you, yeah, that's right, this is the first of them. This remarkable object is a piece of ochre rock where you can see the surface has been smoothed and it's been engraved with geometric patterns. Nobody has any idea what these patterns mean, but it's quite clear that they mean something. They are a sign of intentional, purposive activity on the part of human beings like ourselves. And these are, as I say, 75,000 years old, so much earlier than it was thought that that kind of human symbolic representation existed. Another example from the Blombus Caves is these shells, these the shells with the holes in, which are thought to have been used to make bead necklaces. Now, whatever kind of symbolic language this represents, it's clear that it's some kind of symbolic language. It has a meaning, a recognizable meaning that is beyond the practical use value of the object. Anthropologists now think that the use of red ochre for making paint or painting the body or painting other objects that also indicates some kind of symbolic behavior, very likely some kind of ritual behavior. This can be traced back over 100,000 years. And this suggests that humans have been prompted by more than survival needs to use material objects as a means of transforming the world, not only for a long time, but actually for as long as modern humans have existed. And it may be the very thing that distinguishes modern humans from earlier forms of humans that existed for the previous, I think it's about 1.5 million years. I think these objects indicate the emergence of a new form of imagination, which I call symbolic imagination.
He got going on the subject of what he called the symbolic life. And by the symbolic life, he means a life lived in relationship to mostly cultural symbols, but then he would get into what are some possibilities for individual symbols as well, the individual symbolic life. But he says in traditional life, in a mythological age, let's say before the Reformation in Europe, in the Middle Ages, for instance, people lived within a symbolic universe, and they lived with symbols. And what the symbols did for them was connect them to their own psyches, contain their psyches, contain their archetypal images, and gave them a feeling of being connected to something beyond themselves, beyond their own individual lives. They didn't just live an individual personal life, they lived, or had the potential to live, a life of transcendent meaning in relation to God, to the saints, to the devils, to all those invisible beings that inhabited their imaginal world, their mythological world, angels, and so on and so forth. And that this, from a psychological point of view, he says, is a much healthier way to live than the way we live today in modern times. And so he lamented the fact that people no longer have myths to live in and live by. He said when a priest goes to the altar, if he really believes in the symbolic meaning of the Mass, he is a part of the sacrifice. He becomes a sacrifice. He is identified with Christ. And the host and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ that he shares with his congregation, he takes for himself. And this living in relation to these symbols has an effect on his life. It gives him meaning. It gives him a sense of transcendence. It gives him something much larger than his own individual and rather insignificant, usually, life. It puts him into contact with much larger meanings and beings. We don't have that today, he said. But he said human beings need it. And if they don't have it around them in their culture, they tend to get very desperate, and they will find it somewhere. And
I'll talk about the unconscious ally.
Yeah, all right.
Which is that...
Yes, unconscious ally, exactly.
Yeah, it's to do with the way that you can't necessarily tell conscious interaction whether there's a process going on or not. This is particularly important when you work in areas where there's a lot of negative transference. Because some of these patients, they come along week after week, year after year, and they tell you how much they hate you and how much the analysis is not doing them any good. And yet, actually, they still keep coming, and over time, you can see that actually they're getting quite a lot from it, and they're growing and becoming more substantial, and things are making more sense to them. On the other hand, you get patients who come along, and I had one some years ago from whom I learned a great deal, a patient who was absolutely keen as mustard to use an English phrase, very enthusiastic. And she wanted to come as often as possible, so we came work up to 4 times a week very quickly, and on the couch she went and did all the right things. And after a few months, she started missing sessions and became more and more irregular in her attendance. And I came to realize that actually there was no unconscious ally, that what I was actually getting was something that was entirely on the surface, entirely conscious. And after not too long, actually, the therapy just fell apart altogether and she left. And I felt that I had failed with her, as indeed I had. But I learned a lot from it, because it showed me, it gave me an experience of how important the unconscious interaction is. And of course, this is so much what Jung talks about in the psychology of the transference, with that famous diagram of his, where you have the different cross connections between conscious and unconscious, and that terribly important one at the bottom, where there's a connection, a relationship going on between patient and analyst, which is between unconscious and unconscious. And the fascinating thing about this is that although a lot of things come out of that field in the form of symbols, and indeed the way that the transference develops, actually there are some things that never come out of that field. Actually, there are transformative processes going on that I think that you never really know how they happen or understand them. And what I think of, or at least an important component of what I think of as the analytic attitude, is being open to that, having a sort of ear to that area that you don't know and don't understand, which again is a very difficult thing to do.